U.S. Trump tariffs could have damaged agriculture substantially, not just exported grain and ethanol, but imported fertilizer as well.
The latest industry to take a supply chain hit, and that's farming. With a global fertilizer shortage, farmers across the world are having to shift tactics to make sure they have a good crop to harvest and sell.
Trump is proposing what he calls severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizers. His idea here is apparently to support domestic production.
Global agricultural markets are reacting to a major shift in how grain and fertilizer move across borders after Canada confirmed new trade routes and logistics agreements that reduce reliance on the United States as a central transit and processing hub. The value tied to these flows is being discussed at roughly $780 billion over multiple years, covering grain exports, fertilizer inputs, transportation contracts, and long-term supply arrangements. First, the confirmed facts. Canada is one of the world's largest exporters of wheat, canola, barley, and other grains. It is also a major player in fertilizer production, particularly potash and nitrogen-based inputs critical to global food production. For decades, a significant share of these goods moved through or were closely linked to U.S. infrastructure, including rail networks, ports, financial clearing systems, and distribution channels. Canada has now finalized and expanded alternative routes that send more grain and fertilizer directly to overseas markets through its own ports and through new international partnerships. These routes include expanded Pacific access, upgraded Atlantic shipping capacity, and strengthened logistics agreements with partners in Europe, Asia, and parts of the Global South. The change does not eliminate trade with the United States, but it does reduce the U.S. role as a middle step in the process. Officials involved in the logistics planning describe this as a diversification strategy. Recent years have exposed vulnerabilities in global supply chains, including congestion, policy uncertainty, and rising costs. By redirecting flows and investing heavily in domestic and international alternatives, Canada aims to secure more predictable access to buyers while lowering exposure to disruptions outside its control. Markets responded quickly to the news. Grain futures showed volatility as traders recalculated supply paths and delivery timelines. Fertilizer markets also reacted, with prices adjusting in response to expectations about availability and transport costs. While no immediate shortages have been confirmed, sentiment has shifted. Analysts warn that this kind of structural change can have ripple effects far beyond agriculture. Grain and fertilizer are foundational to food systems. When routes change, costs shift. When costs shift, prices eventually follow. This could mean higher input costs for farmers in some regions and increased pressure on food prices for consumers. For the United States, the development raises practical questions. U.S. farmers and agribusinesses rely heavily on Canadian fertilizer, especially potash. Any change in how that fertilizer moves can affect timing, pricing, and availability. At the same time, U.S. ports, rail operators, and logistics firms that previously handled large volumes of Canadian exports may see reduced traffic. This does not mean trade has stopped. Canada and the United States remain deeply connected agricultural partners. Large volumes of grain and fertilizer will continue to cross the border. However, the balance is shifting. Canada is choosing routes that give it more direct control over delivery and pricing. The scale of the investment behind this move is significant. Billions have been committed to port expansion, rail upgrades, storage facilities, and digital tracking systems. These investments were planned over several years but have accelerated amid global uncertainty. This could mean Canada is positioning itself not just as a producer, but as a logistics power in its own right. International buyers have welcomed the changes. Direct routes can reduce transit time and lower exposure to bottlenecks. For countries concerned about food security, stable and predictable delivery matters as much as price. Analysts warn that competition for reliable suppliers is intensifying as climate pressures and geopolitical tensions disrupt agriculture worldwide. The fertilizer component is especially sensitive. Fertilizer prices surged in recent years due to supply constraints and energy costs. Any change in major supply routes draws close attention. By redirecting shipments and securing alternative logistics, Canada aims to stabilize output and protect long-term contracts. For U.S. agriculture, the implications depend on adaptation. Domestic fertilizer production exists, but it does not fully replace Canadian supply. If logistics become more complex or expensive, farmers may face higher costs. This could mean thinner margins, higher food prices, or increased pressure for policy support. Transportation networks will also feel the impact. rail lines and ports that once handled steady Canadian volumes may need to adjust operations. Some may pivot to other cargo, others may face reduced revenue. Analysts warn that infrastructure designed around old trade patterns can struggle when flows change. The broader context matters. Around the world, countries are rethinking how essential goods move. Food and fertilizer are increasingly viewed as strategic assets, not just commodities. Ensuring access during crises has become a priority. This mindset favors diversification over dependence. Canada's move reflects this shift. Reducing reliance on a single corridor or partner lowers risk. It also increases bargaining power. When suppliers have options, negotiations change. This could mean future trade discussions happen on different terms. At the same time, such shifts can strain relationships if misunderstood. It is important to note that this is not a hostile action. It is a commercial and strategic decision shaped by recent experience. Analysts warn against framing it as confrontation, as that can escalate tension unnecessarily. Consumers may not notice immediate effects, but over time, changes in agricultural logistics influence grocery prices, export competitiveness, and rural economies. Food systems are interconnected. A decision in one country can affect dinner tables thousands of miles away. Environmental considerations also play a role. Direct shipping routes can reduce handling and emissions in some cases, but longer sea journeys can increase them in others. Balancing efficiency and sustainability remains a challenge. This could mean future investments focus on cleaner transport alongside capacity. Financial markets are watching closely. Agriculture-linked stocks, shipping firms, and fertilizer producers are adjusting forecasts. Investors are trying to understand whether this shift represents a one-time adjustment or a long-term realignment. Public reaction has been mixed. Some see the move as smart planning in an uncertain world. Others worry about fragmentation and rising costs. Both perspectives reflect genuine concerns. What is clear is that the old assumption of fixed trade routes is fading. Flexibility is becoming a competitive advantage. Countries that invest early gain options later. For the United States, the moment may prompt reassessment, strengthening domestic infrastructure, diversifying import sources, and maintaining reliable partnerships. Could reduce vulnerability. Analysts warn that ignoring these signals risks falling behind in a rapidly changing system. For Canada, the challenge will be execution. New routes must deliver on promises of reliability and cost control. Any failure could undermine confidence. This could mean continued investment and close coordination with international partners. As this transition unfolds, attention will remain high. Food security is not an abstract issue. It affects stability, health, and trust. Decisions made now will shape outcomes for years. As viewers consider this development, one thoughtful question remains. In a world where food and fertilizer routes are being redrawn, how can countries protect their own security while keeping global cooperation intact? The longer-term consequences of this agricultural realignment are now coming into clearer focus, especially as shipping data, contract disclosures, and infrastructure timelines begin to align with the announcement. What initially appeared as a logistics adjustment is increasingly being viewed as a structural change in how food and fertilizer move across the global system. One of the most immediate effects is on pricing behavior. When routes change, so do cost assumptions. Transport distance, insurance, port fees, and storage all factor into final prices. Even if production levels remain steady, altered logistics can push costs higher in some regions while lowering them in others. Analysts warn that these shifts rarely balance out evenly. For farmers outside Canada, especially in countries dependent on imported fertilizer, predictability is critical. Planting seasons do not wait for shipping delays. If fertilizer arrives late or at higher cost, yields suffer. This could mean tighter global grain supplies in future cycles, even if current inventories appear sufficient. In the United States, agricultural planners are reassessing exposure. Canadian fertilizer has long been integrated into U.S. farming systems. Changes in routing may not reduce supply, but they can change timing. Seasonal agriculture is sensitive to timing more than volume. A delay of weeks can matter as much as a reduction in tons. Grain markets face similar sensitivity. Buyers in Asia, Africa, and Europe are already adjusting procurement strategies based on the new routes. Direct shipping from Canada shortens some supply chains and lengthens others. For buyers previously served indirectly through U.S. infrastructure, contracts are being rewritten to reflect the new reality. This could mean U.S.-based trading hubs lose some influence over global grain pricing when commodities bypass traditional centers. Price discovery shifts. Analysts warn that financial markets tied to agricultural benchmarks may need to adapt to new reference points. Port infrastructure is another focal point. Canadian ports are expanding capacity, storage, and digital tracking to handle increased volume. These upgrades take time, but early phases are already operational. In contrast, some U.S. facilities built around Canadian transit may experience underutilization. Infrastructure underuse has economic consequences. Jobs, maintenance budgets, and regional development plans depend on steady throughput. Communities linked to rail yards and ports may feel gradual pressure as volumes adjust. This could mean local economic stress even without national-level disruption. Global food security organizations are monitoring the transition closely. Any major change in supply routes raises concerns about access for vulnerable regions. While Canada has emphasized continuity, redistribution can still create temporary gaps. Analysts warn that humanitarian supply chains must remain insulated from commercial volatility. Fertilizer markets deserve particular attention. Fertilizer is not easily substituted. Different crops require specific formulations, and production is energy-intensive. When supply chains shift, flexibility is limited. This could mean even small disruptions have outsized effects on food production. Energy prices also intersect with this story. Fertilizer production depends heavily on natural gas and electricity. Transport depends on fuel. If energy costs rise alongside logistics changes, the combined effect can amplify price pressure across agriculture. Trade relationships are adjusting quietly. Countries receiving more direct Canadian shipments may strengthen long-term contracts. Those facing reduced access through U.S. channels may seek alternative suppliers. This reshuffling could reshape alliances in agricultural trade over the next decade. For Canada, managing expectations is crucial. Becoming a more direct supplier increases responsibility. Delivery failures or quality issues would have greater impact without intermediaries. This could mean stricter quality control, better forecasting, and more transparent communication with buyers. Financial institutions are recalibrating risk models. Agricultural lending, insurance, and futures markets rely on assumptions about supply stability. When those assumptions change, credit terms and hedging strategies adjust. Farmers and traders alike may face new conditions. Environmental impacts remain mixed. Shorter routes reduce emissions per shipment, but increased volume through certain corridors may strain ecosystems near ports. Balancing efficiency with sustainability will require careful planning and regulation. Public perception continues to influence the narrative. Framing the shift as being cut out simplifies a complex process. In reality, trade networks are evolving rather than breaking. Analysts warn that oversimplification can harden attitudes and hinder cooperation. Policy coordination becomes more important in this environment. Even as routes diversify, regulatory alignment helps prevent friction. Standards for safety, quality, and environmental impact must remain compatible to avoid unnecessary barriers. The private sector plays a decisive role. Shipping companies, rail operators, insurers, and commodity traders execute the transition day by day. Their choices determine whether the shift is smooth or disruptive. This could mean private investment matters as much as public policy. Technology offers tools to manage complexity. Real-time tracking, predictive analytics, and digital contracts can reduce uncertainty. Countries and companies that adopt these tools faster gain advantage. Looking ahead, climate pressure looms large. Extreme weather affects crops, ports, and transport routes. Diversifying logistics is partly a response to this risk. Analysts warn that climate volatility will continue to test food systems. The broader lesson is adaptability. Systems designed for efficiency alone struggle when conditions change. Systems designed for flexibility endure. Canada's move reflects a bet on flexibility. For the United States, the moment invites reflection rather than reaction. Strengthening domestic resilience, maintaining open dialogue, and adapting infrastructure can offset potential losses. This could mean modernization rather than retreat. Global cooperation remains essential. Food and fertilizer are shared necessities. No country benefits from instability. Maintaining trust while adjusting strategy is the central challenge. As markets absorb this realignment, volatility may ease, but the structure will remain altered. What replaces the old routes will shape trade for years. As viewers consider the deeper meaning of this shift, one thoughtful question remains: As global food systems reorganize for resilience, how can nations compete for security without undermining the cooperation that keeps the world fed?